In the scorching heat of an August morning in 216 BC, 80,000 Roman soldiers stood in perfect formation on a dusty plain in southern Italy. They represented the largest army Rome had ever assembled. 8 full legions, the pride of the Republic, veterans and fresh recruits alike, packed so densely that their shields touched. The consuls who commanded them were confident. How could they not be? They outnumbered their enemy nearly 2 to 1. They wore the best armour, carried the finest weapons, and represented the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever seen. Across the field, separated by perhaps a mile of sun-baked earth, stood a very different army. 50,000 men from a dozen different peoples. Carthaginians from North Africa, wild-haired Gauls who fought half-naked, Spanish warriors with their curved falcata swords, Numidian cavalry on horses that seemed to dance. And at their centre, commanding them all, stood a man who would orchestrate what military historians still call the most perfect battle ever fought. His name was Hannibal Barca, and in the next few hours he would destroy the Roman army so completely that the very word for this battle would become synonymous with military genius for the next 2,000 years. This is the story of Cannae, but it's not a story about death and tragedy. It's a story about tactical brilliance so profound that every military academy in the world still studies it today. It's about how one man, outnumbered and outgunned, used nothing but his understanding of human psychology, battlefield geometry, and perfect timing to achieve the impossible. From Napoleon to Eisenhower, from the Prussian General Staff to modern Special Forces commanders, everyone who studies warfare eventually asks the same question. How did Hannibal do it? How did he take an army of mercenaries and misfits and turn 80,000 of Rome's finest soldiers into a massacre that still defines military excellence 2 millennia later? We're going to find out. Because the Battle of Cannae isn't just history, it's a masterclass in how human ingenuity can overcome overwhelming odds. It's proof that thinking differently can defeat superior numbers. And it's a window into the mind of perhaps the greatest tactical genius who ever lived. To understand how Hannibal pulled off this impossible victory, we need to understand who he was and how he ended up on that Italian plain in the first place. Hannibal Barca was born in 247 BC in Carthage, the great trading empire of North Africa centered in what is now Tunisia. His father, Hamilcar Barca, was himself a renowned general who had fought against Rome in the First Punic War. That war had ended badly for Carthage. They'd been forced to pay massive reparations and surrender Sicily to Roman control. Hamilcar never forgot the humiliation. According to the ancient historian Polybius, when Hannibal was just 9 years old, his father brought him to the altar of their gods and made him swear an oath. "I swear," the boy said, "that I will never be a friend to Rome." It was a vow that would shape the rest of his life and nearly destroy the Roman Republic in the process. Young Hannibal grew up in Spain, where his father had established Carthage's new power base, developing the rich silver mines that would fund their military ambitions. These weren't just any mines. The silver extracted from Spanish territories was some of the richest in the ancient Mediterranean. It gave Carthage the financial resources to build armies, maintain fleets, and most importantly, pay soldiers. Because unlike Rome, which relied heavily on citizen soldiers fighting for the state, Carthage's military was largely made up of mercenaries, professional soldiers from across the Mediterranean who fought for pay. This meant money was literally Hannibal's lifeblood. Without those Spanish silver mines, his entire campaign would have been impossible. Hannibal learned warfare at his father's side, studying tactics, logistics, and the art of command. But he also learned something else crucial. He learned about different cultures and how to lead diverse groups of people. Spain under Carthaginian control was a melting pot of Iberians, Celts, Greeks, Phoenicians, and native tribes. Hannibal grew up navigating these cultural complexities. He learned their languages. He studied their fighting styles. He understood their motivations. This education would prove invaluable when he commanded an army made up of soldiers from dozens of different peoples. When Hamilcar died in battle, around 228 BC, leadership of the Carthaginian forces in Spain passed to Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal. But Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC, and the army acclaimed Hannibal, who was then about 25 years old, as their commander. This wasn't a political appointment from Carthage. The soldiers themselves chose him. They'd watched him grow up among them. They'd seen his courage, his intelligence, his fairness. They wanted him as their leader. Carthage confirmed the appointment, and Hannibal began consolidating Carthaginian control over Spain. By all accounts, he was extraordinary. He could endure the same hardships as his soldiers. He slept on the ground with them. He ate the same food. Ancient sources tell us he would often go without sleep for days when military necessity demanded it. He would ride or march at the head of his army, visible to all his men, and yet he was also capable of incredible mental focus, planning campaigns in minute detail while managing the logistics of moving tens of thousands of men and animals across vast distances. He spoke multiple languages fluently, which meant he could command his multicultural army directly. He could address Gallic warriors in their Celtic tongue, Spanish troops in Iberian, African cavalry in Punic, and Italian allies in Latin. This linguistic ability wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It showed his troops that he understood them, that he respected them enough to speak to them in their own language, and it meant orders could be communicated directly without the delays and potential errors of translation. Hannibal possessed something even rarer than courage or endurance or linguistic ability. He had the capacity to see a battlefield, not as it was, but as it would become. Most generals see the present state of battle, the current positions of forces, the immediate threats and opportunities. The great generals see time as a dimension of combat. They see 3 moves ahead, like a chess master. Hannibal could look at a battlefield and visualize how troop movements would unfold over the next hours. He could predict enemy responses to his actions. He could see the future state of the battle and position his forces to exploit it. This cognitive ability, this capacity to think in terms of dynamic systems rather than static positions, was perhaps his greatest weapon. In 218 BC, Hannibal made the decision that would astound the ancient world. Rather than wait for Rome to attack Carthage's territories, he would take the war to Italy itself. But how do you move an army from Spain to Italy? The Romans controlled the sea. The obvious land route along the Mediterranean coast would put him at a serious disadvantage, forced to fight through hostile territory with Roman armies blocking his path. So Hannibal chose the impossible route. He would cross the Alps. With an army of 40,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, in late autumn, over mountains that reached 14,000 feet, through passes that were already filling with snow. This wasn't just military strategy, this was one of the most audacious gambles in all of military history. Nobody had crossed the Alps with an army before. The Romans thought it was impossible. That was exactly why Hannibal chose to do it. The crossing began in October 218 BC. Hannibal led his army from Spain, through southern Gaul, gathering Gallic allies along the way. By the time he reached the Alps, he had perhaps 50,000 men. The climb took 15 days of absolute hell. The higher they climbed, the narrower the paths became. In some places, the trail was only wide enough for single file. One slip meant a fatal fall into gorges thousands of feet deep. The army had to cross rivers swollen with autumn rains. They had to navigate paths covered in ice and snow. And then there were the mountain tribes. These weren't people who had any love for either Carthage or Rome. They saw a foreign army passing through their territory and attacked for plunder. Hannibal had to fight running battles while climbing mountains, which is as difficult as warfare gets. Ancient sources describe ambushes where tribesmen would roll boulders down on the marching column from above. The Carthaginian army couldn't properly deploy to fight back. They could only endure and keep moving. The elephants were a particular problem. War elephants were Carthage's secret weapon, prehistoric tanks that could break enemy formations just through the terror they inspired. But elephants aren't built for alpine conditions. They're African animals used to heat and open plains. The cold affected them badly. They couldn't navigate icy paths designed for mountain goats. Several fell to their deaths. Others died from cold and exhaustion. By the time Hannibal reached Italy, he'd lost more than half of them. In one famous incident described by the historian Livy, the army came to a place where a landslide had destroyed the path. There was simply no way forward. The rock face was too steep to climb, and the drop too far to descend. Hannibal's engineers studied the problem. They realized they needed to cut through solid rock to create a new path. But how do you break through rock when you don't have modern tools or explosives? The solution they came up with shows both desperation and ingenuity. They gathered all the timber they could find in that barren alpine landscape. They built huge fires against the rock face and let them burn for hours, heating the stone to extreme temperatures. Then they doused the superheated rock with vinegar, the strongest acid they had available. The thermal shock caused the rock to crack and fracture. They could then break through it with picks and hammers. It took days of work, but they carved a path wide enough for the army and the remaining elephants to pass. This technique, fire and vinegar to fracture rock, was remembered and recorded because it seemed almost miraculous. The crossing took 15 days and cost Hannibal dearly. He lost thousands of men to cold, avalanches, falls, and combat with mountain tribes. Perhaps 20,000 men died in those mountains. More than half the elephants perished. By the time the army descended into the Po Valley in northern Italy, they were exhausted, hungry, and depleted. A Roman army meeting them in the foothills could probably have destroyed them. But the Romans weren't there, because the Romans thought crossing the Alps was impossible. They'd stationed their armies elsewhere, expecting Hannibal to come by sea or along the coast. When word reached Rome that Hannibal had appeared in northern Italy, with an army and elephants, the Senate simply couldn't believe it at first. How had he gotten there? How had he crossed mountains that nobody thought could be crossed? This psychological victory was almost as important as the physical achievement. Hannibal had done what the Romans thought impossible, and now he was on Roman soil, ready to fight. The psychological shock of this achievement rippled through Rome and gave Hannibal's army a reputation for supernatural abilities. If they could cross the Alps, what else could they do? The Romans had no idea what they were dealing with. In their first battle, at the Trebia River in December 218 BC, Hannibal used the cold weather and the terrain to his advantage. He drew the Roman army across an icy river at dawn, then attacked them while they were exhausted, freezing and disorganized. The Roman force was shattered. 20,000 soldiers died. The survivors fled to Rome with news that sent shockwaves through the Republic. There was a foreign army in Italy, and it was winning. The following spring, in June 217 BC, Hannibal pulled off an even more devastating victory at Lake Trasimene. He lured an entire Roman army of 30,000 men into a narrow valley beside the lake, where fog obscured the battlefield at dawn. Then he sprang an ambush from the surrounding hills. In 3 hours, 15,000 Romans died. Another 15,000 were captured. It was, until Cannae, the worst defeat Rome had ever suffered. The Romans were terrified. They appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, and gave him emergency powers to deal with the threat. Fabius was smart. He recognized that Hannibal was a tactical genius who excelled at pitched battles. So Fabius refused to give him one. Instead, he shadowed Hannibal's army, harassing its supply lines, avoiding major engagements, and waiting for the Carthaginians to run out of food and money. It was brilliant strategy, and it worked, for a while. But the Roman people hated it. They called Fabius the Delayer as an insult. They wanted revenge for their losses. They wanted glory. They wanted to crush this upstart African who dared invade Italy. And so, when Fabius's term as dictator ended, the Senate chose not to renew his powers. Instead, they elected 2 consuls to lead the army, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. These 2 men would command the force sent to destroy Hannibal once and for all, and the Senate gave them an army unlike anything Rome had ever fielded. 8 legions, 80,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry. It was overwhelming force designed to crush Hannibal through sheer numbers. The Roman plan was simple: find Hannibal, pin him down, destroy him. What could possibly go wrong? In the spring of 216 BC, Hannibal made his move. He marched to the town of Cannae in the Apulian Plain, a region in southeastern Italy near the Adriatic coast. Cannae was a Roman supply depot, and by capturing it, Hannibal did 2 things. First, he secured food and supplies for his own army. Second, and more importantly, he gave the Romans something they couldn't ignore. He had taken a strategically important position, and he was sitting there, waiting. The Romans would have to come to him, and when they did, he would be ready. The Roman army marched south in search of Hannibal, alternating command between the 2 consuls on a daily basis, as was Roman custom. Ancient sources describe Varro as impetuous and eager for battle, while Paulus was more cautious. Whether this characterization is fair or just ancient historians making Varro the scapegoat for what happened next is debatable. But what's certain is that when the Roman army found Hannibal near Cannae, they were confident in their numerical superiority. The 2 armies encamped near each other, along the Aufidus River. Hannibal had arrived first and chosen his position carefully. He'd placed himself between the Romans and their supply lines, forcing them to either retreat in humiliation or fight, and he'd studied the terrain meticulously. The battlefield was a relatively flat plain, but Hannibal had positioned his forces facing north. This meant the Romans, when they formed up to face him, would be looking south, into the hot wind that blew from the Libyan desert, carrying dust and grit, into the morning sun. Small details, but Hannibal missed nothing. On August 2nd, 216 BC, it was Consul Varro's day to command. He ordered the Roman army to form up for battle. 80,000 men prepared to crush the Carthaginian upstart once and for all. Here's where Hannibal's genius began to show. He understood Roman tactics better than the Romans themselves. He knew how they fought. The Roman army relied on the legion, a formation of heavy infantry that advanced in a dense column, using their shields and short swords to grind down the enemy through superior discipline and weight of numbers. It had won Rome their empire, and the Romans were absolutely confident in its effectiveness. Hannibal was going to use that confidence against them. The standard deployment for a Roman army put the heavy infantry legions in the centre, with cavalry on the flanks, to protect against encirclement. The Romans at Cannae did exactly this, but because they had such a massive force, they made their centre exceptionally deep. Imagine not a line of soldiers, but a column. They packed their legionaries so tightly that the formation was deeper than it was wide. The logic was simple and brutal. They would smash straight through Hannibal's centre with sheer mass, then roll up his flanks from the middle. Hannibal's entire army would collapse. It should have worked. Hannibal deployed his 50,000 men in a formation the Romans had never seen before. In the centre, he placed his Gallic and Spanish infantry. These were his least reliable troops. Good fighters, brave and fierce, but not as disciplined as his African veterans. And he didn't form them in a straight line. Instead, he arranged them in a crescent shape, bulging forward toward the Romans. At first glance, this looked like a tactical error. The centre was exposed, pushed out ahead of the rest of the army. The Romans must have smiled when they saw it. Hannibal had given them a perfect target. On the flanks of this crescent, set back slightly, Hannibal positioned his heavy African infantry. These were his best troops, veteran soldiers, many of them re-equipped with armour and weapons they'd captured from Romans in previous battles. They were invisible at first, concealed behind the forward bulge of Gauls and Spanish. The Romans couldn't see them clearly and didn't understand their significance. On the far wings, beyond the infantry, Hannibal placed his cavalry. On the left wing, near the river, he put his heavy Gallic and Spanish cavalry. On the right wing, he placed his Numidian light cavalry. These Numidians were extraordinary horsemen, perhaps the finest light cavalry in the ancient world. They could ride without saddles or stirrups, guiding their horses with just their knees, while throwing javelins with deadly accuracy. The Romans had cavalry too, of course, but they were outnumbered in mounted troops, and Roman cavalry had never been their strength. Still, with 80,000 infantry, the Romans weren't worried about their cavalry disadvantage. They were focused on that tempting, bulging centre of Hannibal's line. They were going to smash right through it. Hannibal stood with his troops in the centre, not in the rear, giving orders from safety. He was in the front ranks, where his men could see him, where he could feel the pulse of the battle. Ancient sources tell us he wore distinctive armour, so his soldiers would know he was there, fighting beside them. It was the kind of leadership that inspired fanatical loyalty. The battle began with the cavalry engagements on the flanks, as was typical in ancient warfare. On the Roman right, near the river, the Roman cavalry faced Hannibal's heavy Spanish and Gallic cavalry. The fighting was brutal and close-quartered, hemmed in by the riverbank. The Carthaginian cavalry, better trained and more experienced, overwhelmed the Romans. They routed them completely, sending the survivors fleeing from the battlefield. The Roman right flank was now completely exposed. On the Roman left, the Roman cavalry engaged with the Numidian light cavalry. This was a different kind of fight. The Numidians were skirmishers, using hit-and-run tactics, harassing the Romans with thrown javelins but avoiding direct combat. They kept the Roman cavalry occupied, but not destroyed, not yet. Hannibal needed them there, distracted, for what came next. With both Roman cavalry forces engaged, the infantry in the centre began their advance, 80,000 men moving forward as one mass. The earth must have shaken with their footsteps. The Romans were confident. They outnumbered the enemy almost 2-1 in infantry alone. They had better armour, better weapons, better training, and that bulging crescent of Hannibal's centre looked like it was going to collapse any second. The Roman column slammed into Hannibal's centre. The Gauls and Spanish fought fiercely, but they were being pushed back. Slowly, step by step, the crescent that had bulged toward the Romans began to flatten. Then it began to curve inward. The Romans were winning. They could feel it. They pushed harder, packing even more tightly together to maintain pressure. The soldiers in the rear ranks pressed forward, eager to get into the fight. This was exactly what Hannibal wanted. He had baited the trap, and the Romans had taken the bait completely. The Gauls and Spanish in the centre kept giving ground, but they didn't break. This is crucial. A lesser general would have lost control here. The centre was being driven back under enormous pressure, but Hannibal had prepared them for exactly this. They fell back in good order, maintaining their formation, keeping the Romans engaged, and with every step backward, the Romans pushed deeper into what was becoming a pocket. The Roman formation, packed so tightly together to maximize their crushing force, began to lose its discipline. Think about what happens when 80,000 men are compressed into an ever-shrinking space. The soldiers in the front ranks were still fighting, pressing forward against Hannibal's centre, but the soldiers in the middle ranks were just pushing. They couldn't see the enemy. They couldn't fight. All they could do was add their weight to the mass, trying to drive forward through sheer pressure. And the soldiers in the rear ranks couldn't even see what was happening. They just knew everyone was pushing forward, so they pushed too. This is exactly what Hannibal wanted. Every Roman soldier who pushed forward into that pocket was another soldier who would be trapped when the jaws closed. And the Romans, trained to maintain tight formations and advance aggressively, couldn't help themselves. Their discipline, which had won them an empire, was being used against them. The Roman legionaries began to realize something was wrong when the soldiers on the edges of the formation started dying. The tight formation meant information travelled slowly. The men in the centre had no idea that the flanks were being attacked. They were focused entirely on the enemy in front of them. But gradually, inexorably, the perimeter of the Roman force began to contract as Hannibal's African infantry killed their way inward. The Romans, packed so tightly in pursuit of Hannibal's centre, couldn't respond. Modern military historians have done calculations about the density of the Roman formation at its peak. They estimate the soldiers were packed with less than 3 feet between them. That's not enough space to fight effectively with a short sword. It's barely enough space to stand. The soldiers in the middle of the formation literally couldn't raise their weapons. They couldn't turn around. They couldn't do anything except stand there and be pressed from all sides. The heat must have been unbearable. August in southern Italy is hot under normal circumstances. Now imagine 80,000 men packed together, wearing metal armour, standing in the sun. No breeze could reach the centre of that mass. Men were suffocating, dying from heat stroke, even before a weapon touched them. Ancient sources mention that some Romans died simply from being crushed by the press of their comrades. This wasn't battle. This was a compression chamber, a slowly tightening vice that squeezed the life out of an entire army. And then the final piece of Hannibal's masterpiece fell into place. Remember the Carthaginian cavalry that had routed the Roman cavalry on the right flank? They didn't chase the fleeing Romans off into the distance, as cavalry often did in ancient battles. Pursuit of routing enemies was natural, instinctive. It was where cavalry could rack up easy kills and claim glory. But Hannibal had trained his cavalry better than that. They understood the plan. They knew their role wasn't to chase routing Romans. Their role was to complete the encirclement, so instead of pursuing, they reformed. This alone is remarkable. To break off from combat, to reorganize scattered cavalry units in the middle of a battle, to maintain discipline when instinct screams at you to chase the enemy, this takes extraordinary training and leadership. But Hannibal's cavalry did it. They reformed into coherent units and rode around behind the Roman infantry. They travelled perhaps 2 miles, circling the entire battlefield. On the other side, the Numidian cavalry had been skirmishing with the Roman cavalry, keeping them engaged but not decisively beating them. Now, with the Carthaginian heavy cavalry approaching from behind, the Numidians intensified their attack. The Roman cavalry on that flank, already struggling, found themselves caught between 2 forces. They broke and fled. Now both Carthaginian cavalry forces, heavy and light, were behind the Roman infantry, and together they charged into the rear of the Roman army. Can you imagine being a Roman soldier in that moment? You're packed so tightly you can barely move. You've been fighting for hours in the blazing heat. You're exhausted, thirsty, confused. The soldiers around you are panicking. And now you hear horses behind you, the thunder of thousands of hooves, screams of men being ridden down, and there's nowhere to run, nowhere to turn. You're trapped in the centre of a mob of your own comrades, and death is coming from every direction. The trap was complete. The Romans were surrounded. Hannibal had achieved what's called a double envelopment, a pincer movement that encircled the entire enemy army. The Roman column, which had seemed so unstoppable just moments before, was now packed into a killing zone. 80,000 men compressed into a space so tight they couldn't fight back. The Roman soldiers tried to form defensive perimeters, but there was no room. They were pressed against each other so tightly that many couldn't even raise their weapons. The heat was unbearable. The dust choked their breathing, and from all sides Carthaginian infantry and cavalry pressed in, killing methodically. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a slaughter. But here's what makes Cannae so fascinating from a tactical perspective. Hannibal's victory wasn't about better weapons or superior armour, or even particularly about numbers. It was about understanding the enemy's psychology and using it against them. He understood that Romans were aggressive. He knew they would see his bulging centre as weakness. He predicted they would pack their formation deep to maximize hitting power, and he used every one of these assumptions to trap them. The battle lasted all morning. Ancient historians give us staggering casualty figures. Polybius, writing about 50 years after the battle, says 70,000 Romans died. Livy, writing 2 centuries later, gives a similar number. Modern historians debate the exact figures because ancient casualty counts are notoriously unreliable, but even if we assume the numbers are exaggerated, the scale of the disaster is undeniable. The vast majority of the Roman army was killed. Consul Paulus died in the fighting. So did both quaestors, 29 of the 48 military tribunes, and 80 men of senatorial rank. When the Senate reconvened in Rome, there were barely enough senators left to form a quorum. By contrast, Hannibal's losses were relatively light. Polybius records about 5,700 dead, most of them Gauls, who had borne the brunt of the Roman assault in the centre. Some modern historians think even this is an overestimate, but regardless of the exact numbers, the ratio is staggering. Hannibal had destroyed an army twice his size while suffering minimal losses himself. When news of the disaster reached Rome, panic gripped the city. Women flooded the temples to pray for their lost sons and husbands. The Senate declared a period of public mourning, but limited it to just 30 days because they feared the city would completely lose morale. For the first time in centuries, there were serious discussions about abandoning Rome and fleeing to a safer location. The survival of the Republic itself seemed in doubt. But here's the remarkable thing. Despite this catastrophic defeat, Rome didn't surrender. They refused to negotiate with Hannibal. They rejected his offers to ransom prisoners. They raised new armies. They adapted their tactics. And eventually, they survived long enough to win the war. But that's another story. What makes the Battle of Cannae so endlessly fascinating is not just that Hannibal won, but how he won. Let's break down the tactical genius behind his victory, because every element was carefully calculated. First, the psychological warfare. Hannibal understood that the Romans wanted to win quickly and decisively. They were angry about their previous defeats and eager for revenge. They had assembled the largest army in their history because they wanted to crush him utterly. Hannibal used this aggression against them. By forming his centre in that tempting crescent, bulging toward the enemy, he presented the Romans with what looked like a weakness. He knew they couldn't resist attacking it. Second, the use of terrain. Hannibal had chosen the battlefield carefully. By positioning his army facing north, he forced the Romans to face south, into the sun and the hot wind from the Libyan desert. This might seem like a small detail, but in a battle lasting hours, under the August sun, it was exhausting for the Romans. They were squinting into the sun, breathing dust and baking in their heavy armour. Meanwhile, Hannibal's troops, many of whom came from North Africa and Spain, were used to such conditions. Third, the formation itself. That crescent shape was revolutionary. Traditional armies formed in straight lines or columns, but Hannibal's crescent served multiple purposes. It tempted the Romans to attack the centre. It automatically began to envelop the enemy as they advanced, and it disguised the position of his elite African infantry on the flanks. When those troops wheeled inward to attack the Roman flanks, the Romans were completely surprised. They hadn't seen the trap being set. Fourth, the cavalry tactics. Hannibal's use of his cavalry shows masterful understanding of combined arms warfare. He didn't just win the cavalry battle and call it done. His heavy cavalry routed the Roman cavalry on one flank, then reformed and rode around the entire battlefield to attack from the rear. This level of coordination and discipline in ancient warfare was extraordinary. Meanwhile, his light Numidian cavalry kept the Roman cavalry on the other flank, occupied and unable to help their infantry. Every unit had a specific role, and every role contributed to the final encirclement. Fifth, and perhaps most important, was Hannibal's control over his forces during the battle itself. The centre of his line was being pushed back under enormous pressure. Lesser troops would have broken and run, but Hannibal had prepared them for exactly this. They knew the plan. They understood that giving ground was part of the strategy, and they held formation even while retreating, which is one of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare. This kind of discipline in the heat of battle, with thousands of Romans pushing at you, required extraordinary training and leadership. The Romans, by contrast, fell into every trap. They formed their infantry too deep, which limited their flexibility. They didn't protect their flanks adequately. They didn't keep their cavalry in reserve. They pursued too aggressively into the centre, without maintaining awareness of their surroundings. And once they were encircled, their very numbers became their doom. There were so many of them packed so tightly that they couldn't fight effectively. Military historians have been studying Cannae ever since, trying to understand and replicate Hannibal's achievement. The double envelopment he executed became known as the Cannae model and influenced military thinking for 2,000 years. The great German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, writing in the 19th century, studied Cannae extensively. He recognized it as the perfect example of what he called a battle of annihilation, where you don't just defeat the enemy army, but destroy it completely. For Clausewitz, the goal of war was to destroy the enemy's ability to fight, and Cannae showed how that could be achieved through superior tactics rather than superior numbers. Count Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the German General Staff in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, became absolutely obsessed with Cannae. He studied it in minute detail and even wrote a treatise simply titled Cannae. Schlieffen became convinced that the double envelopment was the key to winning wars quickly and decisively. He dreamed of achieving a Cannae-style victory on a massive scale. This thinking directly influenced the Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy for World War I, which attempted to encircle and destroy the French army through Belgium. The plan failed, partly because conditions in modern warfare were very different from ancient times, but Schlieffen's obsession shows how powerfully Cannae captured military imagination. During World War II, German officers still studied Cannae as the ideal battle. The concept of blitzkrieg, with armoured units punching through enemy lines and then encircling them from behind, was directly inspired by Hannibal's tactics. The Germans achieved several Cannae-style victories in the early years of the war, particularly in France in 1940 and at Kiev in 1941, where they encircled hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in World War II and later President of the United States, wrote about Cannae in his memoirs. He said, "Every ground commander seeks the battle of annihilation. So far as conditions permit, he tries to duplicate in modern war the classic example of Cannae." Think about that. More than 2,000 years after the battle, one of the 20th century's greatest generals was still trying to figure out how to replicate what Hannibal had done. Even more recently, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who commanded coalition forces during the Gulf War in 1991, specifically cited Cannae as inspiration for his strategy. The famous left hook maneuver that encircled Iraqi forces in Kuwait was consciously modelled on Hannibal's double envelopment. Schwarzkopf had studied Cannae at West Point and recognised that the same principles could apply to modern mechanised warfare. Today, Cannae is taught at military academies around the world. West Point studies it. Sandhurst studies it. Every serious military education includes analysis of Hannibal's tactics. Staff officers learn about the importance of understanding your enemy's psychology. They study how to use terrain to your advantage. They analyse how to coordinate different types of forces for maximum effect. They examine how to maintain discipline and execute complex manoeuvres under pressure. All lessons from Cannae. But here's what makes this even more impressive. Hannibal wasn't just lucky. Cannae wasn't a one-time fluke. He had already demonstrated his tactical genius at the Trebia and at Lake Trasimene. He would go on to win more victories. His entire 15-year campaign in Italy showed consistent brilliance. He was outnumbered. He was far from home. His supplies were limited. His government in Carthage gave him minimal support. And yet he held off the full might of Rome for over a decade. That's not luck. That's genius. What's even more remarkable is that Hannibal was operating with a coalition army. His forces included Carthaginians, Numidians, Libyans, Gauls, Spanish, and various Italian allies who joined him after his victories. These groups spoke different languages, had different fighting styles, and different cultural backgrounds. Holding such an army together would be difficult enough in peacetime. Hannibal did it in the middle of a war, maintaining their loyalty and discipline for 15 years in enemy territory. Ancient sources tell us about Hannibal's leadership style. He led from the front. He shared the same hardships as his soldiers. When supplies were short, he ate the same rations. When they marched, he marched. When they fought, he fought. This kind of leadership created intense loyalty. His soldiers would follow him anywhere because they knew he wouldn't ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He also showed remarkable adaptability. When his war elephants died crossing the Alps, he adapted. When Rome changed its tactics under Fabius, he adapted. When he faced different types of armies, he adapted his tactics to exploit their specific weaknesses. He wasn't locked into one way of fighting. He was constantly observing, learning, and innovating. The Battle of Cannae shows us something profound about warfare and about human capability. Superior numbers don't guarantee victory. Better equipment doesn't guarantee victory. What matters is understanding. Understanding your enemy's strengths and weaknesses. Understanding the battlefield. Understanding psychology. Understanding how to use every element at your disposal to maximum effect. The Romans at Cannae had every material advantage. More soldiers, better armour, better weapons. They were fighting to defend their homeland. They had every reason to expect victory. But they lost because Hannibal understood them better than they understood themselves. He predicted how they would deploy. He anticipated how they would attack. He knew they would be aggressive and impatient, and he used all of this knowledge to trap them. This is why Cannae remains relevant 2,000 years later. The specific circumstances of ancient warfare, the weapons and armour and tactics, those have all changed. But the underlying principles haven't. Psychology still matters, terrain still matters, coordination still matters, leadership still matters, understanding your opponent still matters. These are timeless principles of conflict, whether you're fighting with swords and spears or tanks and aircraft. There's also something inspiring about Cannae from a pure human achievement perspective. Hannibal was facing impossible odds. He was outnumbered nearly 2-1. He was far from home, with no reinforcements coming. His enemies controlled the seas and could replace their losses, while he couldn't. By every logical calculation, he should have lost. But he didn't lose because he refused to play by the enemy's rules. He changed the game. He made his weakness, his smaller numbers, irrelevant by fighting in a way that the Romans couldn't counter. It's the ultimate example of how thinking differently can overcome material disadvantage. It shows that intelligence and creativity can defeat brute force. It proves that understanding matters more than size, and it demonstrates that one person with a brilliant plan can change the course of history. Let's think about what Hannibal couldn't do at Cannae. He couldn't make his army bigger. He couldn't give them better weapons or armour. He couldn't change the fact that Rome had more resources. He couldn't alter the strategic situation that put him in Italy in the first place. All he could control was how he used what he had, and he used it perfectly. The planning that went into Cannae must have been extraordinary. Hannibal had to train his multicultural army to execute complex maneuvers. He had to scout the terrain. He had to predict Roman behaviour accurately. He had to coordinate cavalry and infantry across a battlefield several miles wide. in an era before radios or even reliable signal systems. He had to time everything perfectly. The centre had to hold just long enough. The flanking infantry had to wait for exactly the right moment. The cavalry had to win their battles quickly and then circle around at precisely the right time. One mistake anywhere in this sequence, and the whole plan falls apart. If his centre breaks too early, the Romans aren't trapped yet and can respond to the flanking attack. If his cavalry gets bogged down in their fights, they can't complete the encirclement. If his African infantry attack too soon or too late, the timing is wrong. Everything had to work together like a perfect machine, and it did. Think about the level of communication and training required. Hannibal couldn't just draw up a battle plan the night before and expect it to work. His troops had to understand their roles. They had to trust the plan. They had to trust him. This kind of coordination takes months or years of training. It takes leadership that inspires absolute confidence, and it takes troops who are skilled enough and disciplined enough to execute complex maneuvers in the chaos of battle. Modern military doctrine talks about something called combined arms warfare, where different types of units work together synergistically. Infantry, cavalry, artillery in modern terms, or tanks, infantry, and air support today. The principle is that these different units support each other and create advantages that none of them could create alone. Hannibal was doing this 2,000 years before it became formal doctrine. His cavalry, his heavy infantry, his light infantry, and even his centre troops, who appeared to be losing all, worked together in a coordinated system. Each part made the other parts more effective. There's also the question of how Hannibal himself functioned during the battle. He was commanding in the centre, where the fighting was heaviest. Ancient sources say he was actually in the front ranks at times. How do you maintain situational awareness of an entire battlefield when you're personally engaged in close combat? How do you send orders to units on the flanks when you're fighting for your life? Part of the answer is that Hannibal had trained his subordinate commanders well. He didn't have to micromanage every unit. His cavalry commanders knew what to do. His infantry commanders understood the plan. They could execute their roles without constant direction from the top. This is another mark of great leadership, training your people so well that they can operate independently while still working toward the common goal. But Hannibal also had to have extraordinary tactical vision. He had to see the battle developing, recognize when each phase was ready to begin, and make split-second decisions as situations changed. Because battles never go exactly according to plan. There are always surprises, always complications. The ability to adapt in real time while maintaining the overall strategic vision is what separates good generals from great ones. After Cannae, the question everyone asks is, why didn't Hannibal march on Rome? He'd just destroyed Rome's army. The city was in panic. He could have besieged it, maybe even captured it. His cavalry commander Maharbal supposedly said to him, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you don't know how to use it." But Hannibal's decision not to march on Rome wasn't a failure of nerve or vision. It was realistic assessment. He didn't have siege equipment. His army, while victorious, was still outnumbered by Rome's total military capacity. Rome could raise new legions. They had allies throughout Italy and reserves they could call up. And Hannibal couldn't receive reinforcements or supplies from Carthage because Rome controlled the sea. A siege of Rome would have been long and costly, and Hannibal didn't have the resources for it. Instead, he continued his strategy of trying to break Rome's alliances in Italy, hoping to isolate the city and force a political settlement. It didn't work ultimately. Rome was too resilient, too committed to total victory. But Hannibal's decision not to march on Rome wasn't military failure. It was strategic realism. The Romans learned hard lessons from Cannae. They adapted their tactics. They stopped trying to fight Hannibal in pitched battles and went back to Fabius's strategy of attrition. They attacked his supply lines. They kept multiple armies in the field so he couldn't concentrate his forces. They took the war to Spain and Africa, forcing Carthage to fight on multiple fronts. And eventually, they won. Hannibal was eventually recalled to Africa to defend Carthage itself. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, he faced a Roman army commanded by Scipio Africanus, a general who had studied Hannibal's tactics and learned from them. At Zama, for the first time in his career, Hannibal was defeated in a major battle. Carthage sued for peace. The Second Punic War was over, and Rome had won. But even in defeat, Hannibal remained a figure of respect and fear. The Romans never forgot what he'd done. For generations afterward, Roman mothers would quiet crying children by threatening Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal at the gates. The psychological trauma of those years, when a foreign army rampaged through Italy and nobody seemed able to stop it, became part of Roman cultural memory. And Hannibal himself remained free for years after the war, serving Carthage in civilian government and later going into exile when Rome demanded his surrender. He died in about 183 BC, either by suicide to avoid capture by Romans or by natural causes. Even in his 70s, with his war decades behind him, Rome still considered him dangerous enough to hunt. What Hannibal proved at Cannae was that tactical genius could overcome material disadvantage. He showed that understanding the enemy was more valuable than outnumbering them. He demonstrated that leadership, training, and innovative thinking could defeat conventional superiority. And he created a battle that became the gold standard for military excellence, studied and admired for 2,000 years, and counting. When we look at Cannae today, we're not just looking at an ancient battle. We're looking at a perfect example of how human ingenuity operates at its highest level. How does someone facing impossible odds achieve the impossible? They understand the problem better than anyone else. They see solutions that others miss. They prepare meticulously. They adapt constantly. They lead effectively. And they execute with precision. Every element of Hannibal's victory required excellence. The strategic vision to choose the right battlefield. The tactical genius to design the perfect formation. The leadership to inspire and train troops from a dozen different cultures. The discipline to execute complex maneuvers under pressure. The courage to lead from the front. The wisdom to know what was possible and what wasn't. All of it came together on that August day in 216 BC to create something that still amazes us. There's a reason military commanders study Cannae even in the age of drones and satellites and precision-guided weapons. The technology changes, but the principles don't. Understanding your enemy still matters. Using terrain to your advantage still matters. Coordinating your forces still matters. Maintaining discipline under pressure still matters. Leading from the front still matters. These are timeless lessons about conflict and about human capability. Cannae reminds us that humans are capable of extraordinary achievement when they combine intelligence with will. Hannibal didn't win because he was physically stronger or had magical powers. He won because he thought more clearly, prepared more thoroughly, and executed more perfectly than his opponents. That's something we can all learn from, whether we're studying military history or not. The battle also shows us the value of preparation. Hannibal's victory wasn't spontaneous. It was the result of years of experience, careful study of Roman tactics, meticulous training of his troops, and detailed planning. Genius without preparation is just wasted potential. But preparation, channeled through genius, that's what creates moments like Cannae. And finally, Cannae demonstrates the importance of leadership. Hannibal's soldiers followed him through the Alps in winter. They stayed loyal to him for 15 years in enemy territory. They executed complex battle plans under extreme pressure. They did all this because they believed in him. They trusted his judgment. They knew he cared about them. They saw him leading from the front, sharing their hardships, risking his life beside them. That kind of leadership is rare and precious, and it's what made the impossible possible. Today, more than 2 millennia after that August morning in southern Italy, the Battle of Cannae remains relevant. Not because we're likely to face armies with spears and shields, but because the underlying lessons about understanding, preparation, coordination, and leadership are eternal. Hannibal's tactical genius at Cannae showed humanity what we're capable of when we think differently, plan thoroughly, and execute perfectly. From Napoleon studying Hannibal's campaigns in the 19th century to Schwarzkopf referencing Cannae in the Gulf War, to modern military academies teaching it to future officers, the Battle of Cannae continues to inspire and instruct. It stands as a monument to human ingenuity, a reminder that intelligence and preparation can overcome even overwhelming odds. The Romans who died at Cannae were brave men fighting for their homes, but they were outthought, outmaneuvered, and outcommanded, not because they lacked courage or strength, but because they faced someone who understood warfare at a level they couldn't match. Hannibal saw the battlefield not as a place where armies clashed, but as a three-dimensional space where movement and timing and psychology all mattered. He saw the future state of the battle, while his enemies saw only the present moment. This is what tactical genius looks like, not flashy heroics or impossible luck, just deep understanding, meticulous preparation, and perfect execution. It's why Cannae is still studied. It's why the name Hannibal still resonates. And it's why this battle from 216 BC remains one of the most impressive achievements in military history. When you stand on the plain of Cannae today, it's hard to imagine that terrible morning. The fields are peaceful now. But 2,000 years ago, on this ground, one man showed the world what's possible when genius meets opportunity. He took 50,000 diverse troops and used them to defeat 80,000 of Rome's finest soldiers. He did it through intelligence, not magic, through preparation, not luck, through leadership, not superiority, and in doing so, he created a battle that still teaches us about human capability more than 2 millennia later. That's the real wonder of Cannae, not the death toll or the military victory, though those are staggering. The real wonder is what it reveals about human potential, about how far intelligence and preparation can take us, about how leadership can inspire ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things, about how understanding the problem deeply enough can show you solutions that others never see. Hannibal Barca at Cannae showed us that with enough genius, enough preparation, and enough understanding, you can overcome odds that seem impossible. You can face an enemy twice your size and destroy them. You can turn weakness into strength through clever tactics. You can achieve something so perfect that people study it for thousands of years, trying to understand how you did it. That's not just military history. That's a lesson about human achievement itself. And that's why we're still talking about Cannae more than 2,000 years later. Tomorrow, we'll explore another chapter of human achievement and ancient wonder. But today we celebrate the tactical genius of Hannibal Barca, who proved on an August day in 216 BC that intelligence and preparation can overcome anything, who showed us that understanding your opponent is more valuable than outnumbering them, and who created a battle so perfect that it's still the standard by which all military victories are measured. This is what humans can accomplish when we think differently, prepare thoroughly, and execute perfectly. This is Cannae, this is genius, and this is why we remember